Okay, so welcome everyone to the SCAG-ZETI, the SCAG Zero Emission Truck Infrastructure Study TAC meeting number 5. We're very happy to have you all back. It's been a while since the previous TAC meeting. With that, I will pass the mic to Jonathan Raspa.
Thanks, Lars. So once again, just want to welcome everyone. I know it's been a while since you've heard from all of us. We've got a lot of great information to share and not a lot of time, so we're just going to dive right into it. Just a quick, next slide, please. That's me. I'm the SCAG project manager. Quick reintroduction to the project team. So this is a SCAG project that we're conducting in partnership with CalStart EPRI and funding from the CEC. Cambridge Systematics is our lead. CR Associates, ICF, Red Hill, Tioga, and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab are all part of the team that have been supporting us and doing really great work to get us that much closer to the finish line. Next slide, please. And then again, we've got a really great group of folks from the TAC. Those of you that can make it great, I mean, everybody's been very supportive. So just a quick nod to everyone that's been participating, giving feedback, taking the time to engage with some of our outreach, our interviews, our focus groups. So once again, a big thank you to all of our TAC members. Next slide, please. And just a quick agenda check. So we're just about done with welcome and introductions. Sam is going to take over and go over our progress to date for the project. We've had some schedule adjustments, but we've also made a lot of progress in the last couple months. Anurag will go over our baseline modeling results and what the outputs were from the charging demand simulations. The ICF team is going to go through the siting tool we've been developing and the site assessment process we're going to be using to provide examples of how other jurisdictions, charging developers can approach assessing a site in line with SCAG's approach to this. And then I'll touch base again and go over our next steps between now and our next TAC meeting and the conclusion of the project. So I'm going to hand it off to Sam. He's going to go over project progress.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Yes, it has been a while since we last met. As you saw last time, we were just getting into the modeling and just talking about how we're going to move forward with that step. So Lars, if you can invite to the next slide. So now we're at TAC meeting 5. It did take longer than we thought to do all of the modeling and help with kind of really going from draft to final on the process and methodology for that. So as we are right now, we're looking at the land assessment and we're starting the process for prioritizing stations and station locations. The next step we're going to have is kind of bridging all the modeling together and start the assessments of the 24 high-level locations that we're going to look at. And then we're going to wrap up the whole report by the time we get to TAC meeting 6. At that point in time, we'll be able to have both the blueprint, the primer, and really have an action plan as we want to move this forward. Lars, if you can go to the next slide. Just a recap from where we were in TAC meeting 4, as I talked about, now we're at the phase where we're actually integrating the 2 streams in terms of modeling and our siting. So we'll be talking more about that one today, both Anurag and Sam and Theodore. We've also refined our analysis, moving from preliminary analysis that we discussed at the last TAC meeting into draft and final analysis phases. So we are able to move forward the overall methodology and move forward with our modeling and the site assessments. Sam and his team are leading the case study developments, utilizing the typologies to really help set out a blueprint for what can do at different site locations under different conditions, and they'll go over that today. And now we're going to start up our second round of engagement using these draft results to get an understanding of how real they feel, to give people an understanding of what we've been working on, and also to get some feedback to make sure that we're incorporating any of the feedback we can about our results early. So if there's any adjustments that need to be made, or if there's other things we can incorporate so that when we get to the actual blueprint, we can incorporate that information and make sure we're doing this holistically, involving our stakeholder engagement and making sure we're really taking into account what the public and what our stakeholders are telling us about the future of electrification and hydrogen within the field. Next slide, Lars. So just to touch briefly on the technical work, right now we've done our baseline and we're going through a number of modeling scenarios to better understand what could potentially change and how those changes could impact the modeling results. We're looking at different adoption rates. We're looking at different scenarios of where locations could be stood up. So we're doing all of that in the background, and those are going to help inform how we're looking at prioritization in the sites that we will be potentially standing up in the future in terms of kind of siting assessments. As we talked about, we're looking and assessing the land supply right now and moving through the phasing of kind of creating our prioritization and general understanding of how these stations will be incorporated within the blueprint as we move that forward. If you go to the next slide, Lars. Anurag is now going to take over and talk more about those modeling results and give a better understanding of not only the transportation side, but some of the energy elements that we're seeing come out of all of the modeling. Anurag?
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Jonathan. Welcome, everybody. It has been a minute. So for the rest of the presentation, as we talk about the technical elements, we'll recap a little bit about what we had said in previous tags. I'll lead with that. Sam Ponazeri will do that and Theodora will do that when we talk about the site assessment as well. Just a reminder of what we are doing and how we what we're hoping to accomplish, and then what we see as preliminary results. Lars, thanks. When we start, so the modeling again, there are two aspects to this. There is a transportation modeling and the energy modeling, both coming together. And we're trying to solve for three key questions. One is, what is the total amount of energy that will be needed for horizon years as the transition occurs from where we are today to zero emission fuel vehicles? The focus of this study is primarily public charging and setting out a blueprint for that for medium and heavy duty truck infrastructure. So we will differentiate, we need to differentiate between depot and public charging. And finally, when we talk about zero emissions, it's not just electric. Hydrogen is a critical part. Parts of the region have got large hydrogen grants as well. So we need to pay attention to both public charging and refueling facilities. How many? What is the peak capacity? And how do we measure? And what are the variables as we do the scenario testing? Our approach in doing this transportation modeling and the energy modeling together is sort of driven by the way we think about other infrastructure. When you build a brand new transit system, or when you're building a brand new roadway, how do you measure volume? Is it reasonable? How would the distribution happen across competing sites? So the primary model generates some result, but then how do you start paying attention to make it more reasonable? So we go into this with clarity in the future for our region. Those are our primary focus items. So this is the three questions. Now we do a little bit of a recap for the transportation modeling. Next slide, please. If you remember, we spoke last time about using telematics data from commercial vehicles, and to understand and to build these daily patterns for the trucks. Like, it's not just individual trips, but what is a cumulative travel pattern? And then to start measuring, if this truck were to travel this way, when will it run out of charge? And if it was a battery or a hydrogen fuel, when will it run out of fuel and where? We're generating results for 3 horizon years, 30, 35, and 40. And the travel model, or the travel summaries that we've generated, we've checked for consistency with the statewide model, because as Jonathan mentioned in the beginning part of the study, even though this study focuses on SCAG, there is a strong tie-in with the study that's being led by CalSTART and EPRI at a statewide level. Another mention to have consistency as we start thinking about what percentage of these total trucks or total truck trips in the future will be zero emission. We maintain consistency with the AATE3 scenario that has been adopted by CEC. The statewide effort does not require a hydrogen scenario, but for SCAG, we're also testing what the fuel needs will be as we do hydrogen. Next slide. And then as we start thinking about these energy requirements and adoption of transition to a new type of truck, it's important to understand the market segments, because the market segments drive certain behavioral changes. So these are the 8 markets we came up with. Really, there are 4, but we classify them differently for medium and heavy duty. There is a drayage market. Then there is a regional market, which has a home, that is a base depot location. Then there is a regional, which doesn't seem to have like a depot location. So they are local, but they do not have like a large facility where they're stored, or they don't go back to that same facility over and over again. And then of course there is a long haul, and the long haul market, because they travel everywhere across the country, primarily relying on public charging more than the others. So these are the ways we created the market segments ahead of time. So when we start looking at the results from the energy, it allows us flexibility to test, is the energy model and the travel model, are they talking well together? Are the results reasonable? Or do we need to do some post-processing to have stronger rules for certain type of markets saying that are likely to do depot charging versus others? So again, there's a lot of checks and balances that have been built on the transportation data side. So once we generate results, we have the flexibility to adjust, modify, and plan, and come up with more reasonable behaviors. This is the transportation side. I'll take 2 seconds to talk on the energy side as well. Next slide, please. On the energy modeling, the model that was developed by Berkeley National Lab has been modified to take into account these daily patterns as opposed to just treating individual trips separately. There are 3 charging options: a private depot and then 2 public, right? It's en route charging as well as destination charging. Once we produce the detailed transportation data, a little bit of modification was done to the trip data to match some of the AAT3 inputs. So when we run our baseline energy scenario, there is some consistency between the results that were already prepared for CEC versus what you're producing for these studies today. And the energy modeling is a simulation approach, right? That's why we prepared individual truck profiles. And so when you run these models, there's variability in when they charge and when they say trucks need to charge where and how. So multiple runs are needed to converge to a consistent and reasonable load profile. And so some of these runs have been done, but to actually do this really well, you need thousands of runs or hundreds of runs to actually come up with a consistent load profile. So we'll talk a little bit about how we do some post-processing to account for the fact that we cannot do thousands of runs when we are comparing multiple scenarios. And next slide, please. A little bit more on how we operationalize the energy model. We had to come up with an initial set of sites and locations where public charging, as well as where en route charging can occur. So we came up with about 1,000 locations. Started with the statewide truck parking locations, which we had led an effort for Caltrans. And then we filled the gaps on major interstates and large facilities just to ensure consistent coverage, both in the SCAG region and statewide. So that's how we ended up with about 1,000 sites. These 1,000 sites, these are not pre-selected sites. We're not saying that this is only where charging should occur. These are a means to get us started. These sites were also not constrained by the amount of energy that could be available and the number of charges that could be available. But we will adjust and we'll show you how we're starting to make those assumptions and do those analysis as we go down this step. Next slide, please. So those are the 2 backgrounds, recaps, and now we start talking about what is actually generated. We're generating 2-3 key aspects. Some to ensure reasonableness, to say, yeah, this looks fine. The next one is trying to start getting down into actionable insights ultimately, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the critical element is this work has to and will tie in with some of the site prioritization work that my colleagues from ICF will talk in the later part of this presentation, because we see this as one consistent wave. We did the outreach at the beginning. We understood what people were saying. We did a lot of literature review to understand where the industry is evolving, and it's evolving rather fast and not consistently. So we've tried to take into account as much as we can. We've taken into account some of the work that's been done by CEC. And then ultimately the site level brings into account, well, what is actually possible or what may be possible in our region, which depending on where you are, can be super constrained for land, or in other places there is more availability, but there's actually not a lot of truck travel. So just a lot of pieces that all need to be woven together to tell a consistent story. So that's sort of the background about where we are and how we have gotten to this point and what are captured. In the next few slides, we'll talk a little bit about this baseline scenario, that is AAT3, and how we see those three questions being answered. So if you go to the next slide, please. And by the way, I'm focusing today on the electric portion of it, not necessarily the hydrogen. That will come. We're working on that. We do have preliminary results, but we didn't want to overwhelm you with a ton of information all at the same time. So this is what we see as a total energy requirements by county. Logic check, if we focus just on 2030, the three large counties with a lot of trucking activity or warehouses or ports, LA, Riverside, and San Bernardino, dominate in terms of the amount of energy that is needed. Orange County, which is dense, comes a close fourth. And then two of the smaller ruralish or more agriculture focused. Ventura does have a port. I do not want to discount it at all, but have slightly lower energy needs. So that's as you look down the column in 2030, you look down the column in 2035, you look down the column in 2040. That's reasonableness for us. But then as you look across, you also see how the growth occurs. And there is significant growth in different areas as more and more trucks become electrified as time goes by. And you can see that the percentage growth in some places is steeper than others. So these are the checks that we're doing to say, are these reasonable? And do these generally make sense in terms of magnitude? Of course, none of this is perfect. Why? Because adoption in a brand new technology will have ups and downs. So none of this is going to be perfect, but are we in the ballpark and are these reasonable are the things that we're looking at. If you go to the next slide, then we start looking to see, well, what is the percentage that is going to be by public charging versus depot charging? Right now, on average, it's about 40%. When we started our effort, we had heard from CEC and other reports that have been done that is about 20% public versus 80% depot. So we'll look back at these results. We'll again, as I said, because we have the individual brackets for different truck market segments, we have the ability to change some of our assumptions and to change how trucks may charge. But this is what it looks like as we lay out. And then if you go to the next slide, Jonathan actually prepared a nice chart which shows the growth in the public charging demand county by county across the 3 horizon years, because that is super important as we start thinking about staging and as we start thinking about infrastructure development. And as a community in the SCAG region, as we start thinking about how much energy is needed, how do we support developers and how do we support the trucking community in building out this infrastructure as they transition. And as you can see in the chart, the blue lines are public energy. The gray is private, but the number at the top is the growth across the time horizon only for the public charging. So you can see that you go from 30 to 35, there's actually a pretty significant growth because we see a pretty steep uptick in adoption rate between 30 and 35. Then it sort of levels off. It is still growing, but it's not growing as rapidly. So based on what we see in CEC, thinking about it, there's a pretty large inflection point between the 30 and 35 period. So infrastructure growth needs to start happening sooner to catch up with the demand in the 30 to 35. So these are checks we've done with some of the assumptions that the state has. We will run a few scenarios. This is the baseline scenario, but we will run a few scenarios where we test the growth in adoption rate and say, well, what if growth was more straight line between 30 and 40? What if it grew slowly, but caught up faster after 35? So we'll have variants of this growth just because we want to be able to capture what would happen and what could things look like under different scenarios. But this is what the preliminary scenario looks like. And then if you go to the next slide, we also lay out what the energy requirements look like. These are hex bins, right? And we've taken the study region and identified places where we had predetermined some public charging locations where we had said, hey, these are places where there is interstate or facilities. So you'll see some gaps because that's where a lot of mountains, forests, national parks exist. So not necessarily hit up public charging sites there. But you can see the growth, right? And it's a consistent chart. The the max red means same across the 3 years. So you start looking to see what the growth looks like across time and across these areas. And you can see the intensity of growth in the core parts of our region, but you can also see some of the yellow dots turning into bright orange as time goes by. This is the first part of it, which is, hey, here's the assumptions. Here's what the preliminary results look like, unadjusted, straight out from the transportation and the energy model. But then when we start getting to a site, we need to pay a little bit more attention, because this work until this point is driven purely by, hey, here's the demand that we see, and what would it take to support this demand? What it does not account for is that as businesses start to think about electrification or different types of fueling, there may be different rules that come into place. One of the things that I heard from one of our TAC members in the past was fuel price changes day by day. Electricity price changes hour by hour, right? So when trucking companies make decisions, they're going to influence and think a little bit more about, how do I change my business, or how could I change my business while still serving my customers, but not having to take on the significant cost in terms of charging. So for the next few slides, we'll talk a little bit about how we have smoothed the results, how we have adjusted a little bit of it to drive this rationale of business sense into our models. So next slide, and then the next slide, please. I covered it a little bit, but I'll just say it. We need to apply some of the smoothing curves over these simulations, because we want to convert the energy and travel outputs into practical solutions that quantify the number of potential sites that are needed in areas, the number of chargers needed, and then what is the capacity? And the capacity is both total capacity, but also the peak hour capacity, because that determines how many chargers, how much land, and how much electricity you need to account for that in that site. This is, again, not a private sector investment grade study. This is a planning study, but we want to apply those business rules leading up to, so somebody can then take our results and then apply more judicious business rules for their assessment. We believe the smoothing assessment is important for like 3 or 4 key reasons, and I'll talk about it a little bit. One is, if I'm thinking about energy demand, and you saw the hex bins, adjacent hex bins, I expect some variability because the travel patterns and the number of trucks serving each of these will look different. But I shouldn't see huge differences in, for instance, the time of day profile. I shouldn't see huge differences in the way, unless there are very different truck market segments operating, about what kind of mix between depot and public charging and the temporal distribution. Because we do the simulation, we see actually quite a bit of, and because we haven't done thousands of runs of simulation, we see quite a bit of variation. But we believe that some of this load balancing and adjustments need to be done as we produce these results, because we see some of this happening even in every transportation model that we do, right? Highways, when it's completely congested, we'll never see one road which is completely free, which provides the same level of service as another one which is completely full. Some balancing occurs and some adjustments occur. So some smoothing sort of accounts for that. Second piece is time of day. As I mentioned, the modeling today does not account for how businesses may reevaluate and readjust. But we believe over time, businesses will adapt, because they don't want to wait in long lines. They don't want to pay high rates. So they'll be smart about how they charge and when they charge, especially when they charge. And domicile trucks with a home base will start to charge more and more during peak periods and spread it out. They're not going to do all the charging at 7 p.m. They will find ways to automate the charging in their depot a little bit better. Both of these have an implication on what is the peak energy demand that is needed at the site, right? And if I'm a developer, I do not want to build a site where 95% of my energy consumption happens between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. and then my site is empty for the rest of the day. Ultimately, you want to have consistent utilization across the course of the day. Sam Ponazeri mentioned a little bit that about 15% of utilization across the course of the day is what they have seen in some of the business cases that have been reasonable. They can be lower, but that's sort of what we want to start looking at. And then ultimately, how many sites are needed in this area. You could have one mega site and then take care of all of the charging in that area. But we know that land size is a premium in Southern California. We also know that building a large site means a lot of investment to upgrade the utility needs there. So we want to build solutions which say, hey, you could either do this in a single site, or you could have multiple smaller sites with varying charging capacities to sort of meet this demand. So these are the reasons why we need to do a little bit of smoothing to start from where we go, from what we receive from the models, to what we ultimately want to deliver as an end product for this study, for both this study and the statewide study. Next slide, please. I haven't been paying attention to questions, and I hope this all makes sense. We're getting into some deep technical things. If we need to, Jonathan, Sam, and Lars, if you feel the need that I've spoken too much and we need to pause, happy to do that. You guys tell me, or the audience.
And there's not too many questions coming in right now. There are a few that I'll be looking at, but we can pause once you wrap up the smoothing technique conversation. We have a set place to Q&A.
Sounds good, Sam. Thank you. So just, I laid out the rationale, and now let's talk a little bit about how we went about doing it, and then we'll do a case study to see what this actually means. Again, as a reminder, a second reminder to the recap, we started with about 1,000 public charging sites. That's where we began. These are just preliminary sites, so the model will have some places to move these trucks to charge. We then start aggregating these individual sites into these large hex bin 4s, because we do not want to presuppose winners and losers, and that's why the site selection tool becomes important to integrate this output and the next set of outputs. And then we want to capture total energy and peak capacity. And then, as I said, we want to test the different combinations of sites, charges, to say what could happen. Next slide starts talking a little bit about the smoothing rules that we applied. We didn't want for any site or any groups of site in the hex bin to have more than 20% of the energy need occurring in a single hour. We think that this will smooth out over time. We also start doing some reallocation for certain market segments about when they will likely charge, especially the home domicile, as well as depot charging, which means that they are charging inside a facility. We distribute. So if we see that for a certain market segment in a certain area, there was more than 20% or more than excess occurring in a single hour, we redistribute it to late evening between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. So we redistribute it because we believe that that's how it'll evolve over time. And then we also reallocate the public charging just the same way, but we base it based on the number of truck trips that we see. Like you see 8% of truck trips occurring in that zone between 6 to 7 p.m., but you see like 30% of charging occurring there. Can we smooth this out based on what we see in travel occurring there? We understand that there's a bit of a disconnect between the tour-based approach, because trucks may indeed be running out of charge there, but we believe that there'll be better business decisions to help refine it that way. So 2-3 simple adjustments, and we are testing it to see what the ultimate profile looks like. I also mentioned that we also have the ability to say, well, if it's a domicile truck, or if it is doing, or if it's a truck that is doing, is coming back to home base, how much of that charge occurs in a public site versus a depot site? Is that too high? Do we need to say that, well, they're likely to come back to the depot and charge? So there's a few different rules of adjustment. We do not want to make this too rigid, but at the same time, we want to make sure that it has some reasonableness. So that's why we're limiting the number of rules, but again, with good, what we believe is reasonable business logic. Couple of examples now I'll walk you through about what it looks like. So this is Barstow. When we started the assessment, because it's at an intersection of a couple of major highway facilities, we had about 12 potential sites for public charging. And then when we looked at the output results from the energy model, each one of these sites had slightly different energy profiles, obviously. And then you look to see, we just showed the two most egregious examples, like to help you understand what the differences could look like. there is site 1, which has a peak in the morning, and site 2, which is pretty close, but has a peak late in the evening. So they look very different. So if I did this at a site-by-site level, I don't think it paints a really good picture of what's happening. So we want to first, so that means we want to combine all of this. And then next slide, Lars. So then, so what does the energy profile look like for this entire hex bin that's in there? Once we combine everything, we see that there is a peak early in the morning. And it primarily and then we start looking to say, well, what is this site and what does it capture? It's primarily serving heavy duty, long haul trucks, and a little bit of drayage. And so it assumes that today, because these trucks are traveling here, they appear to arrive between 2 and 3. So that's when they charge. But if getting here as part of a destination, and this is where the charging is, we believe that trucks will change their behavior just a little bit to have a little bit more smoothing in that peak hour. So if you can go to the next slide, we start saying, what could that distribution look like for every market segment? So in the first slide on the right at the top, we'll look at depot charging, which has a big peak right about 3 a.m. And that's driving actually the entire market segment, because that few trucks that have that depot charging spike at that hour. So we say, hey, how about distributing it, not having anything more than 20% at night, but redistributing it across the nighttime period? What could that look like? And we don't redistribute it evenly across the entire day. We say, well, let's take a look at other charging events that are occurring at that time. And how about we redistribute it based on those patterns that we look at? And so then the orange curve says, okay, if you redistributed it that way and had a peak of about 19 to 20%, no more than that at any hour, what does the energy profile look like? Same way for the public charging at the bottom, you see a spike late in the evening, but which makes sense. It's public charging. You're trying to take advantage in the evening before you shut down your operations for the evening, especially if you're drayage. Or we say, what could that look like if we distributed a little bit more evenly across night? As you can see, there are not big changes. It's just a little bit of change because the peak just went from 24 to 19%. But now once you combine all of these market segments and then look at the energy distribution, you can see that it's a little distributed across the time of day all the way across, and you don't have as high a peak at 2 a.m. It's a little more distributed throughout the day. What does it mean from a profile perspective? The difference between the original and the adjusted, the grid capacity doesn't change as much. It's still pretty similar, 8.3 to 7. That's not a big change. But because the spike has been minimized, you can see some more significant changes in terms of the number of charges that are necessary. So this could then push us from a medium or a large site to one site lower, right? If we can have better utilization. And this was just an example to guide us through. We're looking at it site by site, area by area, and then looking at bigger picture for the county to make sure that all of these things, as we make adjustments and as we apply rules, they all make sense. I'll take another example. This one is from actually Simi Valley or somewhere in the Simi Valley area. When we go to this one, again, there's a high energy needs site. But once you adjust, when you make similar adjustments, you can actually minimize the peak capacity from 42 megawatt hours to 21. That's a pretty significant decrease. This is a large site anyway, right? So the number of chargers originally could be pretty big, but you can get them to a much smaller level. So it can be a mega site versus just touching a large site. So the variations and the adjustments in each area are different. And this is where we are trying to make sense to adjust, make sure that the changes that we're making are not fundamentally adjusting what is going on and how things are evolving. And you can see by doing this, we have better load profile, and we believe we'll have greater utilization across the course of the day, as opposed to just having like one big spike. And you see that in the red chart that you see on the right. So this is the business logic, and these are some of the tweaks that we are making to make sure that ultimately whatever we produce for the study has a little bit of reasonableness built in. I think that's the last slide for this section. So Sam, I'll turn it to you and Lars.
Great. Thank you so much, Anurag, for presenting all of that information. I realize it's a lot of information, so there may be some questions as they come up. You can use your hand and we can come off mute to answer some questions. We did get a couple in the chat that I want to present to the project team so we can attempt to answer them. One from James Schenkel. He asks, is 15% utilization per hour reasonable because it corresponds with ICE trucks fueling patterns for any particular duty cycle sector? I know we are using Sam, and I know we've talked about this, the 15 to 20% ratio. Sam, do you want to go into that a little bit more?
Sure. That 15 to 20%, James, is just a rough approximate. I mean, like as you probably know, a lot of the charging stations, heavy duty charging stations today might be underutilized, but just based on the light duty experience, once you hit the 20% range of utilization, it's not hourly, it's across the day. So there will be some hours where all chargers are utilized. There will be some hours that no chargers utilized. So on average across the day, once you hit that 15-20%, if you go above those ranges, at least in the light duty space, there has been stations reporting that there's a lot of queuing and a lot of like cars waiting to get to the chargers. So that's why, I mean, we're using that 20%. I mean, again, is a very rough approximate assumption as a benchmark of what it might make sense as a utilization for a public charging station. Not necessarily for a depot, but for a public charging station, what might make sense. Again, totally based on the experience in the light duty space, looking into DC fast chargers and and how they're operating and what the utilizations are at those light duty stations. If the system's perfect, maybe it can go higher. I mean, if the system is a way that trucks can make reservations of the chargers, and like I've heard from some of the charging as a service providers that they're providing those reservations that the charger is available to a company at certain hours, and that company can come in and charge on under those circumstances. Maybe it's gonna be able to go higher. But if it's like the similar model that light duty is right now operating, where you just go to charging stations and you find the open spot and you start charging, that 20%, 15-20% is what we found as being a reasonable number.
Thank you so much, Sam. Leslie, I see that your hand is up if you want to come off mute.
Yeah, thank you so much. What a great presentation. By the way, I just want to compliment you on that. I like how you're looking at a lot of things for the sensitivity, but I've been looking at that whole smoothing notion and then reflecting on what we're hearing from these larger fleets that use Teamster union members to operate their drayage trucks, and they're very shift based. So we talked to a major fleet that operates shipping out of the ports, and they said they've got about 100 drivers that change their shift at a specific time of day. So there's that whole notion of smoothing would be great, but it's not. These aren't light duty drivers, these are heavy duty drivers that are using these trucks for a job. And so that's a real peak. So yeah, I appreciate that you really reflect and understand that there's like a real business shift that's going to have to occur and change on how these jobs are done. Then I started thinking also about the public charging side of things. What we're hearing from some of the work groups that I lead is that at a public charging site, somebody's going to want to show up there and they want to get full capacity charging right then and there. They don't want to have to compromise. And so that site's going to offer, 350 kilowatt chargers. They're going to want to be using that highest power charge because again, time is money. And when you're parked, you can't be waiting extra time, to balance smoothing out. So I see how that really plays the biggest role when it comes to private depot charging, where someone can park trucks overnight and balance that load. So those are the two things I was thinking about. So, and then my third thought was early on in the presentation, you will be bringing in fuel cell trucks and hydrogen into this analysis. I think it would be really important to think about the fleets that are relying on, for the most part, some kind of a public refueling, to play with different percentages of battery electric versus fuel cell, just to just to see how all of that plays out. I have a feeling that it's going to really help the modeling when it comes to balancing out peak demand. So,
Leslie, great points. And you raised questions that I didn't cover in my presentation. I see Tony asking me some questions as well. Because we have all of these market segments laid out in the analysis, we don't have to make adjustments to certain markets, like you say, drayage. We say, hey, they charge when they charge. I think we believe something may happen similar for the long distance hauls, even though I showed an example where we tested and adjusted it. But that's a great point, right? We have the flexibility to make some of these business rules and business decisions. And because we have built the data that way, we can see what would the impacts look like if I made the change, and if I didn't make the change. So we have that flexibility. You brought up another thing that we had, our team, and actually CalSTART and EPRI, I don't know if they're on the call, also had questions for some of the energy modeling, where in some of the early runs, we saw what we called a lot of sipping, right? Which were trucks were traveling, would charge for about 10 minutes, charge to get to a certain level, and then go out. But we changed some of these, knowing that that's unlikely to happen unless you are in a place, in a depot, where somebody says, you're a Formula One car, so while you're changing your tires, or in this case, I'm loading and unloading the vehicle, let me plug and charge you in. That may happen, but unlikely to happen, especially in public charging sites. So we've changed some of the modeling rules already as well to say, how many charging events do we think are reasonable for any truck, especially of different market segments? So we made some of these tweaks that you've said. We can refine them further. And as we start documenting about what our final results look like, what you say, ton of sense. We'll try to capture as best as we can about different elements. And by the way, the data that we have, the telematics data, doesn't quite differentiate whether this truck is part of a large fleet or a small fleet, because that also fundamentally has a big impact on the way trucks charge. We do not have that. So we're trying to back into it by using some of these variables and sensitivities. But we know for certain market segments like drayage, they tend to be mostly small operators. So we can apply different rules, especially for that market. Great questions.
Thank you so much, Anurag. Corey, if you want to come off mute and ask a question.
Yep, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Corey.
Yes, so I wanted to know what analysis have you done on potential hydrogen demand? I know you said specific scenarios are going to be looked at for that, but by the way, great job on the electric side, and really thorough analysis there. So I just wanted to know what the position was on the hydrogen analysis.
On the hydrogen analysis, right now we're using AT3 numbers to help us project those out. In the states model, or in the states analysis, that starts looking at it in 2040. So we don't have near-term calculations for the demand. Sam and his team will review a little bit more about how we're looking at the sites themselves, but we don't have a true analysis of 35 for hydrogen. Ben and his team are working on the 2040 hydrogen modeling. So we don't have those results yet, but as we work through this, Corey, we'll definitely make sure that you can see those results. We can have hopefully broadcast those out a little bit earlier than the final report to help give some ground truthing. I know we want to talk about hydrogen as part of our second round of engagement. So that is something we definitely want to learn a little bit more about. As you know, hydrogen is pretty new in terms of kind of some of the things that have been happening around hydrogen and the development of those charging infrastructure. So it's something we're definitely very interested in learning more about, so we can apply some of those same factors in terms of smoothing and overall understanding that we have of the BEV environment, and apply that to the hydrogen environment as well, to make sure we're giving good representation of how those will flow moving forward in the future.
So on that hydrogen notion, I recommend that you sort of follow what's happening with the ARCH's proposal, because that's really where the larger tranche of funding is going to come in far sooner than 2040.
Yep.
For hydrogen infrastructure. And then the whole ARCH's program is about creating the offtake through helping to support the purchases of these longer haul trucks, purchase of the Class 8 trucks and transit buses. So yeah, I would keep an eye on that. And if you're going to do sensitivity analysis, make sure that you also include an earlier adoption strategy beyond 2040. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. I just wanted to make one more point about that as well. With the hydrogen scenarios, we are going to look at 2030, 2035, and 2040. We also are looking into just SCAG on its own on how some of the issues around hydrogen charging are fueling now. You know, it's been primarily light duty with a few fleets in Southern California that are operating, actual heavy duty fleets. We're really glad that a lot of them are participating in the TAC. We're reaching out to them to get their feedback on just sort of what their expectations versus reality have been, so that even after the ZETI study is done, we can still couch, you know, all of the work we're going to continue to do in the actual experience of the operators and the site developers. What we're not assuming is a perfect rosy scenario for hydrogen. Studies have projected everything from it's going to be, you know, great and it's going to solve a lot of problems to absolute doom and gloom and it's completely, you know, unfeasible. So we want to take a, you know, an actual lived experience approach to this and not just rely solely on studies. So that's another thing we're thinking about beyond, and we're really trying hard to get in touch with Arches on specific site development, some of the assumptions they're making, so that we can kind of either fold that into ZETI, or if it doesn't come in time, since they're, you know, they're just starting to spool up their work, that we can just, you know, sort of supplement the work we've done here with, you know, either partnership or just, you know, good information we're getting from them.
And in the side of information sharing, I'm going to put in the chat the notice for the TRIG infrastructure meeting that I'm leading on November 4th. Our focus is on hydrogen, and so it touches on a lot of what we're talking about right now. So I would encourage someone on your team to listen in.
Yeah, that's great. That's the kind of collaboration and like kind of partnering that we want to get out of this TAC. So that is fantastic, Leslie. Thank you. And we'll definitely be there.
There's a second set of questions. Oh, sorry, I was saying there are a second set of questions that Tony Zamora asked. There's no reason why we're stopping at 750 or a megawatt. Like, these were just examples, Tony, about what it could look like if it were a mix of 350 and 750 or 150, 350 and 750. What flexible, we're not predetermining anything. We're going to have some variations and variables of what this could capture or not capture. So flexible, these were just examples to just frame the mind, because half the group from a TAC does not come from an energy background. Half of you do. So we're just trying to balance providing a transportation group understanding of what energy looks like, while also making some reasonable assumptions of energy. By the way, I'm not an energy guy. So if you ask me why 750 versus 350, I'll say, I don't even know.
No, it was just very specific, but no, I appreciate that. Thank you, Alan.
Yeah, we're just trying to provide just like a bouquet of answers.
Yeah, no, I see that. Yeah, whole range. Yeah, that's cool. Thank you.
Thanks.
And Tony, just to add that, I mean, you probably know, like, I think Tesla deployed some of those 750 kilowatt chargers for the Frito-Lay's, for the PepsiCo, Tesla semis. So
yeah,
there were some real examples of those. I mean, although eventually it may everything get shifted to megawatt chargers, but there were some examples of those.
Yeah, we're hoping. Yeah. All right. Thanks.
And Corey, I see your hand up. We'll take that question, but right after we'll close this and transition to our siting conversation.
Just one more question from Fan on the chat. Maybe we should cover both some.
Let's come back to Fan's question. Just for the interest of time, we're almost at 12.
Quick comment. I just wanted to say very short that once you're taking a look at these different use cases or existing operations of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles in California, you know, please reach out to us, California Hydrogen Business Council. We can connect you with a lot of fleets that are doing that operation today.
Very appreciated, Corey. And we'll move on. Lars, if you can move to the next slide, and we can bring this over to Sam and his team for the next steps. Theodora, appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So let's go to the next slide. We will also start with a quick recap of the overall process of the siting analysis for both electric vehicle public charging and hydrogen refueling infrastructure. And the analysis began by defining the siting criteria groups and sub-criteria. The next step involved prioritizing the criteria. And to achieve this, we had distributed the survey to you, excuse me, to gather feedback on the weights of the criteria. And these steps led to the development of a tool or approach that combines the identified criteria, assigns weights based on importance, and calculates the overall scores for potential refueling locations. So the goal of the tool that ICF developed for SCAG is to allow planners and developers to tailor the site selection process according to distinct priorities such as, for example, demand coverage or equity. And today we will focus on showing you the actual draft tool we have developed. Next slide, please. Before we show you the demo of the tool, we would also like to remind you the main criteria and typologies considered. If you recollect, we have 5 broad criteria categories with several sub-criteria related to utilization or demand, land, such as, for example, existing truck parking, amenities or land use. Then we have equity, grid capacity, and environmental factors such as flood risk or brownfields. Additionally, we've talked about and refined our site typologies. For EV charging and hydrogen infrastructure, we are assuming the 3 main typologies: small, medium, and large facilities. And we use different parameters to characterize them, including the parcel size or the number of chargers or dispensers for each typology at each site. And as we discussed last time, the parameters are informed by literature review, real-world applications, and after we also incorporated your feedback. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're happy to show you a demo of the draft tool we developed. Let's start the video. Thank you. So when the user enters the tool, a pop-up window briefly describes the project. By clicking the About Project button, we can see more detailed information about the project and basic instructions for the tool. We also have a definitions button that provides more details on the definition of its typology and each of the location criteria. And we will also have a more detailed guide, a user guide that is currently being developed and will be added to the tool. Let's now zoom in on an example area. The user first needs to select the typology they're interested in. And the tool has separate tabs for EV charging and hydrogen infrastructure. Using the EV charging infrastructure as an example, let's choose, for instance, the large facilities. And you can see that certain parcels are filtered out. Now, the next step is to review the weights of the criteria. And similarly, there are separate tabs for electric vehicle related criteria and hydrogen related criteria. For each criterion, the user can use the default weights that you can see here, and these are based on your input from the survey. And the results are displayed by parcel. The legend shows the colors corresponding to the different scores assigned to parcels. And let's try adjusting the weights by entering, for example, 50% for truck volume and 50% for the proximity to the disadvantaged communities criterion and 0% for everything else. And then we have to click Calculate Scores. And you can see how the results change. Certain parcels now have a higher or lower score. If we click on a parcel, then we can also view its overall weighted score and the scores for each individual criterion. On the right-hand side of the tool, we have included a feature called Summary Table that shows the number of currently visible parcels in each score range. The user can also filter the results by geography or parcel score. For example, we can choose to display only parcels with a score of 5 and above, filtering out the rest of the parcels. And in addition to the results by parcel, we've also added different data layers that the user can activate. For example, we can view the SB 535 disadvantaged communities, or for example, existing truck parking areas, the green points that you can see here. And finally, the user can download the results either for the entire region or just the currently visible area if different than the entire region. And that's a quick and brief description of the tool and the progress we've made so far. It is still work in progress, and one of our next steps is also to update the trip data we use for the utilization criterion and incorporate energy demand data. Next slide, please. So the next task we are currently working on involves the site assessments. The objective is to identify a sample of example sites and conduct detailed assessments, reporting information such as facility characteristics, proposed EV charging or hydrogen infrastructure, and associated costs. We have selected 24 sites that meet certain criteria. And to talk a little bit more about this criteria, first of all, we are considering two different types of zero-emission vehicle infrastructure, electric and hydrogen. For each type of zero-emission vehicle infrastructure, we have the three typologies, the small, medium, and large facilities. And within each typology, we have also identified 4 use cases that we're going to describe later. The sites, the 24 sites that we selected generally serve as examples to help us understand what the zero-emission vehicle infrastructure and costs might look like across different typologies and use cases. So if we go to the next slide, we will see the 4 use cases we identified so far. The highway charging or refueling use case refers to facilities located along major highways and trucking routes. And these stations may feature pull-through configurations, allowing large vehicles to easily drive in and out without complex maneuvers. Electric vehicle charging stations may utilize high-powered charging systems, for example, megawatt charging systems to ensure quick turnaround, while hydrogen stations may require also larger storage tanks to accommodate high volume traffic. Destination stations are located near facilities such as ports, warehouses, and distribution centers. These sites may typically use pull-in configurations where trucks can decouple their trailers and park to charge or refuel. Electric chargers at these stations may use moderate charger power levels, enable trucks to charge over longer periods while parked or during loading and unloading. Hydrogen stations may require moderate to large storage capacities, tailored to the specific refueling needs of the nearby operations. And then we have urban stations that are designed to support trucks operating on shorter routes that may require frequent recharging or refueling, and are located within urban areas. They may typically employ pull-in configurations to maximize space efficiency mostly. The electric chargers facilitate charging for urban trucks within, for example, 1 to 2 hours, while hydrogen stations may be designed with storage capacities that meet the demand of urban fleets specifically, like delivery trucks. And we do understand there may be overlaps, so that's why we also have the mixed-use typology that integrates the features of highway, destination, and urban charging and refueling use cases. Next slide, please. For each of the 24 sites, electric or hydrogen, we will develop 2-page summaries that provide information, important information for developers when evaluating the site. So first we will outline key facility characteristics such as the parcel size, any existing truck parking, or the land use. Next, we will also include the information on the parcel scoring based on the default criteria from the stakeholder survey. And projected energy demand in the area will also be reported based on the previously presented information on the energy heat maps. Next slide, please. And we will also provide information on the proposed zero-emission vehicle infrastructure and associated costs. And here you can see an example for a medium-sized facility with a mixed use case. The specific site had 30 truck parking spaces, and based on our assumption of dual port chargers and the medium facility typology as it is defined, we recommend installing 15 DC fast chargers, 350 kilowatt each. So using this number of chargers and their peak load, we estimated the required number and sizes of utility pad mounted transformers, meters, and panels. And these estimations were based on ICF's fleet charge model that we use to find facility and utility side infrastructure needs. For each site, we can also assume a solar power system with a maximum peak load from EV chargers, along with a battery energy storage system. And we assume that this is designed to provide power for 4 hours at this capacity. Next, we also estimate the cost of these infrastructure components, including EV charger hardware installation costs, facility and utility side infrastructure, and distributed energy resources integration. Land acquisition costs based on CoStar data for its zip code are also estimated, but would mainly apply in specific cases such as for vacant land development. For this example side, we see that the total cost is around $11.3 million, excluding the distributed energy resources integration. And the unit costs used in this analysis are based on a comprehensive review of literature, for instance, reports from institutes like the Rocky Mountain Institute, as well as market research. In addition to this information that you see here, we will also qualitatively discuss several other considerations, such as traffic and safety implications, access to existing infrastructure, financial aspects, impact on disadvantaged communities, and more. Next slide, please. For hydrogen infrastructure, the proposed setup is based on the typologies and the definition of the typologies. This slide shows an example of a medium-sized urban facility which has a storage capacity of 3,000 kilograms per day and includes 6 dispensers, each with 2 nozzles per dispenser. Based on our discussions during the previous SCAG meeting, we assume hydrogen delivery, specifically liquid hydrogen delivery, due to its advantages, including the ability to transport more hydrogen in fewer trips, reducing logistic costs. Now, finding detailed information on the various cost components for hydrogen is generally challenging, and we are open to feedback in terms of that. There are currently not many hydrogen stations to provide data points, and each company has its own pricing, which is not publicly available. So we focus on a high-level cost estimation for 2 components for which we were able to find more information. These components include the land acquisition cost and the station capital cost. The latter is calculated using a function provided in CARB's hydrogen station network self-sufficiency analysis per assembly bill 8. That's what we used. This function is based on previous hydrogen projects and ABA program cost data. This function shows that the cost to install station fueling capacity depends on the per kilogram per day fueling capacity. And based on this information, we see that the total investment for this example site is estimated to be around $17 million. Next slide, please. This map shows the 24 sites selected. As mentioned, the sites were selected to fit the requirements for the typologies and the use cases. Our basis was to first examine existing truck parking locations and existing fuel stations where we may see higher demand and see if they meet the criteria. The next slide shows the electric and hydrogen sites that are mostly found in the LA area and San Bernardino. For example, we found an existing truck stop near the ports and also near existing hydrogen production facilities, potentially making it a good example for a hydrogen destination facility. And based on its size, it is considered a medium-sized facility. A similar thought process was followed for the rest of the sites. The following slide also shows some locations that are more spread out. One example is, for instance, the Electric Large Highway facility. This site is near Highway 10 and includes an existing fuel station travel center. It also has a parcel size that makes it fit to the large typology. Again, note that these sites are just examples that fit the criteria for typology and use cases and should not be seen as an endorsement of a particular site for infrastructure deployment. And with that, we conclude the main portion of the presentation, and we're now happy to open the floor for any questions.
I am seeing a couple of questions. I saw one from Leslie in the chat. Oh, it looks like Sam was answering it. The question was, are there hydrogen stations and charging depots used in the model assumption to serve the same number of vehicles or refueling events? And then Sam, I don't know if you want to talk more about the response.
Sure. I was not sure if Leslie's asking for about on this a siting analysis or on the previous that Anurag presented, but if it's related to the siting analysis, depending on the size of the, I mean, we presented 3 different typologies: small, medium, and large, and one set for hydrogen, one set for electric. And depending on the technology and the size of those facilities, we're expecting different number of trucks they can serve.
Yeah, thanks. Turning on my mic here. It's just when I look at, a lot of times someone can look at the cost or the total investment tied to each one of them, 11.9. If you've got the DER component on the charging station site versus 17.4 on a larger scale hydrogen site. When I look at the specs on both of these, my first thought is that that single hydrogen refueling site is going to be able to service quite a much larger number of vehicles in short order. And so it's not, I feel like sometimes we need to do apples to apples here, because people can look at these numbers and go, see, when in reality, it would be nice to see apples to apples.
And Leslie, these were just 2 examples. So we will be doing 24 of these examples, basically, for 4 different use cases, 3 different sizes, 2 different technologies. So you will see 24 different numbers. And within each of those, we will have some estimates around like how many trucks they can serve. Obviously, I mean, again, it really depends on the utilization. You can have a perfect system that you have both stations are 100% utilized, but we know that perfect system never happens. So depending on that level of utilization, same conversation like we had in the chat also. I mean, the number of trucks could change. We can provide the maximum number, assuming 100% utilization. What would that look like? And I think that would be helpful for everyone to know, what that means.
Yeah, I hear you, Sam. And when we're talking apples to apples, we should be making the same utilization assumptions when we compare one versus the other in the same capacity assumptions. We'll compare one versus the other. So yeah,
Exactly.
it's just apples to apples. That's all I'm asking.
Ian, I see your hands up if you want to come off mute.
Yeah, hey, sorry I had to miss the first part of this meeting. I only caught this one, and I think I only missed the first slide. So this really interesting tool being pulled together here. I can see sort of a lot of different kinds of use cases for it. Agree with the last little conversation too, that, you know, having a max metric of throughput or assuming 80% utilization or assuming something that just reported for everybody, that makes a lot of sense. One thing that is really difficult in this, and I don't know if there's a way to get at it, maybe not. But a key thing that comes up with all this is time. How long does it take to develop a site? And there's a bazillion things that go into how long, but that also affects price, right? And because part of what this tool is trying to get at is opportunity. Where are there, I think, maybe I'm wrong, but it's like trying to identify where are there opportunities, or what are some ways to kind of put common information out there to identify opportunities. And getting at exact time and exact costs and exact everything is an impossible thing. That's why, you know, you have to go through if you're actually going to develop a site. But is there anything that can be said about, okay, well, if this site is a 20-acre site and it's going to try to pull 10 megawatts, like, is that possible? Or the other side of it is like, and that I know you can, you know, look at the different utility sort of utilization as their circuit capacity and all that. But, you know, what if you have 10 of these sites all in the same circuit? And like, what does that do on timing? Because if you have a cost estimates there, but you can't develop the site for 10 years, which is what it takes sometimes, well, that cost estimate like might be way off. And I don't know. It's a tough thing. Like, how do you get at time in this? But it's the thing that we've heard a lot from developers as they're going through this.
No, great comment. Great comment. In fact, I was talking to Fleet yesterday, and they were telling me, like, initially they were anticipating 6 months development and ended up 3 years just for their depot charging, because of the utility upgrades and a lot of the other issues are raised, which obviously 3 years, the past 3 years, looking at the inflation, you can see like how much they ended up paying versus what they were anticipating to pay. So no, that's a great comment. Unfortunately, it's really hard to estimate the time frame for some of these. One of the things I can tell you in our tool we embedded, which I think it's probably very valuable, is that we were able to combine, at least for the SCAG region, LADWP load capacity data on every circuit plus SCE load capacity on every circuit and incorporate it all into this tool. So for example, if and when you get access to this tool, you go into this tool, put 100% on grid capacity, you can actually see where across the board you have capacity, and the underlying data will give you the sense about, like, for example, if you choose a large site, because the way the tool works is that, I mean, for a large site, it assumes like 40 350 kilowatt chargers, let's say, like, I mean, 12 to 15 megawatt. It will start like scoring the sites based on that load capacity of 15 megawatts. So it will actually give you a quick overview of like which of these sites can handle 15 megawatt. But you made another point, which is very important, is and one of the discussion points we had throughout this development. This tool is as good as today with what we know the grid capacity is, and needs to be updated on a yearly basis to reflect, for example, if on a circuit suddenly a customer comes online and needs like 10 megawatt of load, that circuit capacity is going to drop by 10 megawatt. So, and I know ICA maps that SCE puts out, LADWP puts out, are updating regularly. So that is something like, probably it needs to be discussed, is like how we can upkeep this tool down the road. or what's the shelf life of this tool really? I mean, right now it's based on as of today. If you go here and pick a site, definitely once you pick that site and once it's confirmed, I mean, the capacity and utility application is submitted, probably in the next round of ICA maps, we should see a lower capacity on that circuit unless like SCE does a substation upgrades or some level of upgrades to that distribution. So that's a great point. And yeah, something that we have thought about, but not an easy answer to it.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? That's helpful, thanks. Is this sort of is there like a search function in this? Like I can put in a whole bunch of criteria. I want to have a site that's 10 megawatts and 10 acres and close, this kind of proximity to traffic or whatever it is, and like put in the various things to filter out and say, show me what you got? Or is it you have to put in the site first and it kicks back the information?
No, it has 15 criteria that you can put a weight on those criteria. You can say, I want to prioritize my sites based on the grid capacity, the energy demand from the heavy load modeling within that region, and I want to make sure they're in close proximity to an equity area. So, and the tool will then show you the site, and I want to make sure it can at least handle 40 charges like a large site. The tool will filter out any parcel that cannot handle 40 chargers and will only give you options for those sites that can handle those, and will prioritize those sites based on your criteria. It's not built in the tool, it's in the underlying information of the tool. Technically, you can't pick up parcel and say, okay, well, tell me, underlying data, if we were able to show all of that, pick a parcel and then say like, okay, this is all the information about that parcel, or being able to filter it, but it's not yet embedded. That functionality is not embedded in the tool yet.
Okay, thanks.
The information is there, it's not embedded in terms of the search function, so.
Unless you want, for example, to analyze a specific location, if you have the exact address of the parcel you're interested in, then you can indeed search that in the tool, and the tool will show you exactly the parcel, and then you will now see where this parcel is exactly, and then you can go to the different features, for example, adjust the weights and see the score of the parcel.
I wanted to also follow up some of this conversation. So first, SCAG is still thinking about how we're going to distribute the tool. Right now, we want to get the prioritization tool finished, fully validated with all the information incorporated. And then we're going to discuss internally and with our partners how we want to start to share this with jurisdictions and the public. So that's ongoing right now. We don't have a firm decision on that yet. The other thing, kind of you started talking about how a developer will take one approach to developing a site. Okay, this many chargers or this much power, this much land, maybe in this particular region. We've talked to several site developers doing charging, and we're also in discussion with the hydrogen developers. And a lot of them also have different business models. So some are focused on just identifying sites that have the existing power capacity to meet the site they want, the size and sort of area that they want to develop. It may not overlap exactly with high prioritization areas in this tool. And that's okay. They've decided based on their business model, the markets they serve, the customer base that they think they can attract and the price they can charge, that it'll meet that need, even if it's not high priority based on the ZETI study. Other developers pursue a sort of longer term approach where they actually are working with the grid to develop that additional capacity because they want it in a very specific location, say at their existing depot, at a site they know they can get for a low price because there's not a lot of competition for it given the lack of grid capacity. So it'll also depend on the business model that the site developer or the fleet wants to pursue. And then there's everything in between that, right? So something we can't necessarily address completely with this study. That's why we do include things like land acquisition price in the site assessments. And if a depot already owns that site or they know they don't need the grid upgrades, they can kind of take that share of the costs and remove it. So they can kind of start to figure out what the price is going to be sort of at a high level. And then that'll help them make some decisions about, CapEx, future development, whether they take that approach or a different one. So again, this is kind of like a high level planning tool, but then it'll be up to the individual developers and operators and different fleets to decide exactly how then they want to pursue, you know, an individual approach to meet, you know, their customers' needs, right? And then their profit expectations as well. So something just to keep in mind in all of this, that a lot of this is going to be driven by the private industry. They'll use incentives, but you know, they're making decisions internally that we don't have, you know, perfect transparency on. But if you'd like to share with us, you know, we're always happy to listen to kind of right size our approach and make sure that we're actually, you know, kind of on the right track with what private industry is pursuing as well.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, Sam, and all the questions that have come in. I'm not seeing any new questions in the chat. I'm going to pause for one more second to see if there's any additional questions. If not, we'll move on to our next steps, Jonathan. So just pause really quickly.
Great.
One last call.
Yeah, any final question? And again, you can always reach out to us afterwards. We've got contact information. I can put my direct contact information to the chat as well. I think it's on the fact sheet as well, but I'll put that in here so that folks have it. And Ian, yeah, like I said, timing for next steps on the tool, it'll depend sort of once we finish the project and start to make a decision on how we can integrate this into, you know, SCAG's other data tools, whether it will start as an internal tool for other planning studies or in partnership with jurisdictions, but we haven't made a firm decision on that yet. But we will let this TAC group know once we've made that decision so they can share it with their partners or use it directly.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I think that leads us right into next steps.
Yeah, perfect. Go ahead, next slide, please. Yeah. So like we said, this particular set of data that we showed, this was the baseline scenario. We've been running the additional modeling scenarios. So as Anurag mentioned, it's going to be based on sort of adoption rates and when that adoption ramp up or leveling off actually occurs. We're also not going to follow the AATE3 adoption rates exactly, right? That's one projection made by the state, but we want to make sure that we're exploring other potential future scenarios. And then we will also incorporate a set of hydrogen scenarios for 2030, 2035, and 2040. So again, that'll be one way to help us inform where the charging demand is going to be, how that links up with some of the prioritization work in the next slide that I'm going to talk about. But we want to make sure there's a clear linkage between the two, right? And then all of that will be an overlay to how individual agencies, firms, developers decide to, you know, actually start to build out their fleet and use this either as a way to help guide them, or maybe it shows that they're already on the right track for development that's already occurred. Next slide, please. So for the siting tool, again, we're going to incorporate feedback. I think we aren't able to make this tool public as of yet, you know, to the TAC, but, you know, if folks have other questions about it, want to ask about specific features, you know, please let us know. I think the point about showing the underlying data is a useful one. In many cases, it's not always parcel specific. Sometimes it's a little generalized over an area. But you know, that's a really good point and maybe something we'll consider adding either through this project or at a later date. We're going to do a bunch of QA/QC on all of the parcels to make sure there's no sort of double counting or, you know, sort of data that when you set parameters, you know, say you max out one specific criteria, it shows like a strange pattern that kind of doesn't pass the smell test for how we expected that to be distributed. We're putting together a user guide. There's a whole bunch of metadata requirements that SCAG requires if we do share this publicly that we have to fulfill. So we'll be taking care of that. And then the completion of those 24 site assessments. You saw a little preview here. We'll share the slides. If you have feedback on, you know, what's on the site assessment, we're not looking to make drastic changes, but we are still interested to hear what the TAC has to say about that. So please let us know if you have thoughts, opinions, you know, suggestions for improvement, so that'll help support kind of the final deliverable of what we put into the blueprint and the local agency primer. Next slide, please. Yeah. And then overall on the project, again, we're integrating these two technical streams of work. It's two very different technical specializations, the travel demand side and then the energy side. We also are going to be reaching out to some of the grid operators to get their perspective from a grid management approach. That's not something we can really cover in the study, but we do want their feedback on, okay, how does this map to how you look at the grid overall in the region, in certain areas of your service deployment, to make sure that, again, we're at least mindful of those considerations, and we can either put those details into the final reports, or if it's a, you know, kind of minor post-processing thing, we can put that into the final analysis steps. Like I said, we'll run all those final scenarios for the blueprint. We'll finish the site assessments, and we'll have a draft of the blueprint and the regional action plan. We're hoping to share that with the TAC ahead of the completion of the project, so we can get your feedback on those draft deliverables and then incorporate your responses. We are set to finish by December 31st, so we're on a pretty tight timeline. But we're going to do our best to make sure that you get the TAC gets the opportunity to provide some of their specific sort of industry or regulatory knowledge to all of this. See a couple of questions popping in, providing feedback. Today's slides, we're going to try and get those up as soon as possible. We've got to prep the recording, put the minutes together, and we'll send all of that out to you. I'm hoping within a week or so at most. So, and that'll also be up on the website. The exception is the minutes. We send those directly to the TAC members. So, really quickly, here's some contact information for everyone. That email address under my picture is my direct email address. So again, please feel free to reach out to me directly if you have questions about either technical details of the study. If I am not smart enough to answer them, I will pass them on to our consultant team. And then, of course, for SCAG's plans with the ZETI study, with some of the tools we're developing and what we plan to do with it in the future. If you have ideas or just kind of thoughts on our approach, please reach out and share. We love the feedback. So that's it. Any other questions? Thank you all again for attending and sticking it out to the very end. That's our website right there. That'll have the minutes once they're posted. We'll also send an email out to everyone who attended today with all that information, as well as the minutes. So you all can see a record of today's conversation. So thanks, everyone. I want to thank our consultant team again, Sam, Theodora, Sam Z, and Sam P. Anurag, thanks again, Lars, for everything you've done to pull this TAC together today.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for being here today.
Thank
All right, I hope you all have a great afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.